Everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Lashed to the Mast. Just one announcement. I'm going to be doing a special feature on the Ukrainian-Russian war that's going on right now in about a month's time or so. It'll be a special edition, not part of the political podcast, but keep your eyes on that, and yeah, I hope it'll be really informative for you guys. All right, well, with that, let's turn it over to the philosophy portion of the podcast. Um, in this podcast, we'll review the last podcast briefly before reviewing Heraclitus' position of dynamic monism and the first Thomistic thesis. So, if you guys remember, in the last podcast, philosophy podcast, we examined Parmenides and Zeno's position of static monism before reintroducing the concept of potency. And then, if you remember even further, Parmenides argued that since being can't come from non-being, and since the only thing that could qualify or separate being from itself is non-being, which by definition doesn't exist, then pure being must be all there is, because non-being can't modify it if it doesn't exist. But if pure being is all there is, and there's nothing to qualify or modify it, then change must be impossible. Since change under this framework requires non-being coming into being, which is impossible. Although this is a seemingly absurd conclusion, it actually follows kind of logically if you agree that pure being is the only existent thing and that something can't come from nothing. And then his student Zeno backed it up with these two famous paradoxes, which we looked at in the previous episode, the Dichotomy Paradox, where he posited that it's impossible to go from point A to point B because to get halfway to point B, you need to get halfway to point B, and then you need to get halfway to point B, and so on and so forth. So it's impossible to get a path to position B. And then he also had the paradox of parts, which is that anything with a specific, or anything like a rock, like a rock with size must necessarily be infinitely large, because there is an infinite number of divisions you can make in such a thing as like a stone, and therefore must be infinitely large because all of those infinite ways of cutting it all add up to infinity, and there isn't really an end to them anyway. So so those arguments reinforce Parmenides' claim to static monism. But fortunately, for those of us who wake up in a cold sweat pondering these things, Aristotle solved this apparent conundrum by positing the idea of potency, which is a sort of midway point between being and non-being. And again, this is what the last philosophy video was about, so I'm going to be developing potency a little further here, but please go check out the other one too if you haven't. So to be more specific, potency is defined as a capacity for a certain type of change and is a real aspect of a thing. If you remember Parmenides' definition, he and Zeno denied the reality of change. So if Aristotle can pull this off, then with this idea of potency, then he can explain how change happens. And so this is a really big deal. And yeah, so he's making the point here that potency can't exist without something existent already there. Like, it needs to be like grounded in something already existent. But if you have something already existent, then potency can modify it, and this thing can tend to change in certain ways. Like, for example, let's see, like a snake shedding their skin, like that they have a natural tendency to do that. They have the capacity. There's a potency that they have to wow, I just forgot what the word was, but to get rid of their skin. That would be a real potency. And that's just to back up once again the definition that potency is defined as a capacity for a certain type of change. Okay. It is also the ground for counterfactuals such as how something could behave or could have behaved. So potency is the reason why we know that if you boil water, then, or if you boil an ice cube, it's going to turn into water, because it has that tendency to turn into water upon the actuality of the heat acting on it. So this potency solves the false dichotomy raised by Parmenides and the paradoxes of Zeno by not by denying the premise that something can't come from nothing. Aristotle is fully on board with Parmenides and Zeno when they say that something can't come from nothing. Aristotle completely agrees with that. But he argues that is not what change is. Change doesn't involve non-being coming into being. It involves potency coming into being. And the technical definition for that is called the actualization of potential, where that's kind of a really fancy term, which just means existence making something else, acting upon something else to make it behave in a way that it tends to behave. So yeah, and then as I mentioned earlier, boulders, they have a capacity for rolling down hills, for example, upon being pushed, but not flying like a kite, exploding, or turning into a werewolf or any other crazy thing. If you push a boulder, it's going to go down the hill unless inertia is just too strong. Okay, so that about does it for the review. Let's take a deeper dive into dynamic monism now, as contrasted to the static monism of Parmenides and Zeno. Okay, so in direct opposition to Parmenides, Heraclitus takes the position that only change exists, i.e., there's never anything stable or permanent in reality, but only endless becoming. This position is known as dynamic monism, in opposition to the static monism of Parmenides and Zeno, where dynamic refers to the constant change going on, and monism to what exists in this case. Reality under this idea is just a constant flux of the smallest particles imaginable, which do not coalesce into anything stable. Sorry about that. According to dynamic monism, because only change exists, there can't be anything permanent or stable, and anything which appears to be stable, such as my self-identity and my knowledge of people and their being, it's all an illusion. There are no abiding things such as animals, rocks, planets, or human beings, or anything else. What we mistakenly believe to be a thing is really just a bundle of unrelated things morphing into a completely unrelated bundle of related things, and so on. Like it's just chaos from it at every single level. So as you can see by comparing this static monism to this dynamic monism, the former argues that change doesn't exist. So this is Parmenides and Zeno arguing that change doesn't exist, while the latter, Heraclitus, within dynamic monism, argues that change is all there is. So to put it in Aristotelian terms, to put it in technical terms, static monism accepts act but not potency, whereas dynamic monism accepts potency but not act. We debunked static monism in the last episode by introducing potency, and in this episode we will debunk dynamic monism using the definitions of potency that we learned and act. All right. First things first. If you'll remember the first episode of this podcast where we talked about isolating being as a food critic would isolate ingredients at a Taco Bell, then you will remember that act refers to that which exists. Because actuality exists and potency, because actuality exists and potency is the only capacity for being, actuality must be prior to potency. So, i.e., actuality can exist without potency, but potency can't exist without act. It kind of went back to what I was saying earlier, where you can have this act right here, and then the potency kind of is grounded in it and specifies the directions or the ways in which it tends to change. Here's an example. It is because a certain piece of wood is flammable or technically inflammable. I don't know which one to use. It has the capacity to be burnt. That is, this flammable piece of wood burns, and it is precisely because a jug of water is inflammable that it doesn't burn. Like, this is, just common sense. It is the kind of thing that is which. Oh, sorry, I'm tripping over myself here. Um, yeah, so potency is the kind of thing that determines whether the material, can be set on fire or not. No, sorry, act is. Oh my gosh. Sorry, guys. This is really, really bad. Let me back up here. Yeah, I'm stuttering a lot today. So, all right. Let me go back to the piece of wood. It is because a certain piece of wood is flammable, i.e., it has a capacity or potency to be burnt, that it burns, and it is precisely because a jug of water is not flammable that it doesn't burn. It is act is the kind of thing that determines whether or not the it can be set on fire or not. It is, in other words, it's the thing that grounds the potentiality. Without something already actually determined, there would be nothing for potencies to modify or qualify. So if that piece of wood didn't exist, then you couldn't set fire to anything because there wouldn't be anything to set fire to. Pretty simple. Uh, okay, and then going back to Heraclitus's dynamic monism, we can now see the reason why potency can't exist on its own, but has to modify or qualify something already actual or existent. Um, Heraclitus's denial of actuality and his dynamic monism's denial of actuality is therefore impossible, since the potencies being referred to are not grounded in actuality, not even in the tiniest particles. So remember dynamic monism and what Heraclitus was saying, change is the only thing there is. Well, that would, in Aristotelian terms, that would mean a potency is all there is. But potency can't exist without act. And so the kind of world that Heraclitus is imagining is literally impossible to imagine because there's no act. There's nothing to separate that potency from non-being. Um, yeah. So let's see. Okay. So in light of these explanations of potency and act, we are now ready to examine the first Thomistic principle again. And I know you guys are ramped up for the first Thomistic principle, which states that potency and act so divide being that whatsoever exists either is a pure act or is necessarily composed of potency and act as to its primordial and intrinsic principles. Let me read that again slower. Potency and act so divide being that whatsoever exists either is a pure act or is necessarily composed of potency and act as to its primordial and intrinsic principles. So let's break it down. Contrary to Parmenides and Heraclitus, being is not the only thing that exists. And contrary to Heraclitus, potency is not the only thing that exists. Rather, it is both potency and act which are required to understand existence and change. That's why the first part of this thesis says, potency and act so divide being that whatsoever exists either is a pure act or is necessarily composed of potency and act. Which it just means that everything that exists can be classified as either just pure existence or as a mixture of potency and act. It's very once you understand potency and act, then it makes a lot of sense. It's basically the Aristotelian rebuttal to both Parmenides and Zeno, or Parmenides, Zeno, and Heraclitus. Okay, if you remember as well from our argument against Heraclitus, potency can't exist without something already actual for it to be grounded to. Finally, okay, let's look at the last part of this quote, as to its primordial and intrinsic principles. Now, what on earth does that mean? A primordial principle simply refers to that which is most basic to a thing, which is its existence. After all, if something didn't exist, there wouldn't be anything there to begin with. So, and then as for intrinsic principles, that simply means principles within a thing which determine how a thing behaves, which, as we saw earlier, is simply potency. So, in conclusion, then, Parmenides and Zeno's acceptance of act but not potency, and Heraclitus' exception of potency but not act, are two opposite views which imply absurd things about the world we live in. To remedy the situation, Aristotle agreed with Parmenides and Zeno that change could not involve being coming from non-being, but argued that that is not what change is. Under Aristotle's view, there is a middle ground between being and non-being called potency, which is grounded in the thing itself and determines its behaviors. In addition, it is not true that Aristotle would agree with Heraclitus that change is all there is. Rather, Aristotle puts both act and potency together. Change for Aristotle, then, is the bringing of potencies into being, or to speak more precisely, the actualization of potential, if you'll remember that phrase from earlier in this episode. This leads us directly to the first of the 24 Thomistic theses, which states that potency and act so divide being that whatsoever exists is either pure act or is necessarily composed of potency and act as to its primordial and intrinsic principles. In the coming weeks, we will be examining how exactly potency and act work together and what, further develop the distinction between them. You will probably be doing that through Ed Feser's book, Aristotle's Revenge, and Joseph Owens' contemporary or Christian introduction to metaphysics. But we'll see, how that goes in the future weeks. Well, thank you guys. That should about do it for the philosophy portion of this podcast. So now I will turn it over to the political side. And I'm going to take my customary drink of water here. All right. Welcome to politics. All right. Last week, we took a look at the last half of Book 2 in Plato's Republic, and this week we'll be looking at Book 3. All right, let's start with a recap, as we always do. Socrates' idea of justice stems from two different sources. Remember, this is the second half of Book 2 of Plato's Republic. Socrates' idea of justice stems from two different sources. First, that examining the origins of the city will give us an understanding of justice in a fully functioning city. Second, that this idea of justice in the city will inform us of what justice is in the individual. These are the two controlling principles in Plato's work. So let me restate them. If you learn nothing else by listening to all of these podcasts on Plato's Republic, then just remember these two things. First, that examining the origins of justice in the city will give us an understanding of justice in a fully functioning city. And second, that this idea of justice in the city will inform us of what justice is in the individual. So he's going from origins of the city to justice in the origins of the city, justice in the city, and then justice in the individual. He's chaining them like that. It might be backwards on your screen, but in the last podcast, we examined the first of these claims by looking at the origins of both the city and luxurious city, which in turn led to a discussion concerning the division of labor and eventually the good. With respect to the good, it was examined whether or not certain phrases should be represented as having done harm or not. To this end, certain stories were banned which contradicted this principle, and this is about where Book 2 leaves off. Today, then, we'll be looking at the third book of Plato's Republic, which deals with the governing class of society in general. The third book starts with practically the same material that the second book ended with, i.e. the censorship of certain stories and certain modes of storytelling, which make men soft or afraid. This in turn leads to a conversation over the type of music to be accepted, which concludes that music which doesn't encourage warlike tendencies shouldn't be listened to. Plato is really diving into the weeds here. In this way, Socrates, he's writing this for Socrates, so Plato or Socrates is really going into the weeds here. In this way, Socrates lays out a plan for educating the young, arguing that those who are brought up with these strictures will better be able to identify beauty and goodness, since they've been inculcated with them from youth. Incidentally, this idea of mastery requiring training from youth is also heavily emphasized by Plato's student Aristotle, who we saw in the philosophy portion, in the Nicomachean Ethics, which is also definitely a book we will be going over at some point. It's a pretty epic book. I've read like the first chapter, so I don't know about the rest, but if it's anything like the first chapter, it should be pretty epic. On the basis of this idea of beauty and truth, then, Socrates argues that the pleasure of sex is immoderate and shouldn't be brought into a homosexual relationship between a man and his boy, or at least it shouldn't seem to come into that relationship. So I'm just kind of like presenting what Plato himself says. I'm not really engaging in like a full-on rebuttal. I'm trying to save that for after we finish this series. I might throw in a few comments here and there, but yeah, like I just didn't want this to pass by without people thinking like I agree with it, because yeah, I don't agree with that. Uh, being actively in a homosexual like relationship where you're having sex with the other person is wrong according to the Catholic Church, and yeah, it's just a no go. And I think it'll actually come up again like in book 5 or 6. So yeah, I'll do this critique though at the end of once we've considered all the books in Plato's Republic. All right. So in line with this moderation, the guardian class must be imbued with both gymnastic training and musical training in order not to become too hard or too soft. The conversation turns to medicine, where Socrates says, when a carpenter is sick, he expects to swallow medicine from the doctor. Oh, I forgot to say the beginning of the quote. Beginning quote. When a carpenter is sick, he expects to swallow medicine from the doctor. But if anyone prescribes a long course of treatment for him, putting claws in his head and the things that go with them, he says without hesitation that he has no leisure to be sick and that it's not profitable to live that way. After that, he says goodbye to that sort of doctor, steps back into his accustomed routine, gets healthy, and lives doing the things that belong to him. But if his body isn't adequate to bear up, he's set free from troubles by dying. If they are to die, let them die, and decrease the surplus population, as Scrooge put it. So, notwithstanding the ethic of not harming enemies held by Socrates in the first book, which again which I argued, well, I mean, it was a very like charitable ethic for the time. This particular ethic is pretty brutish to people who are in need of it, in need of doctors. So, in developing this idea further, Socrates argues that judges are a necessary part of the government and that they have a corresponding role with doctors. And here's the beginning quote. Then you will establish by law in the city a medical art of the sort we were talking about, together with this sort of judicial art. They'll care for the bodies and souls of your citizens, those with good natures, that is, but for those who lack them, they'll allow all those so lacking in body to die off, and they themselves will put to death those who have an evil nature in soul and not curable. Thus, for the normal people, population control is practiced both through medicine and through law. Pretty crazy stuff. Socrates now asks the question of which people should rule and answers it by saying that they should not only be those best adept at protecting the city, but those who most love the city. Therefore, the men who need to be selected from among the rest of the guardians. Oh, I forgot. Man, sorry, I keep forgetting to flag these quotes. Beginning quote. Therefore, the men who need to be selected from among the rest of the guardians are those who appear to us, when we examine the whole course of their lives, as if they most of all would do wholeheartedly whatever they'd regard as advantageous to the city, and who wouldn't be willing in any way to do what was not. End quote. Plato stresses that surveying potential future guardians is necessary to see whether they are actually willing to do whatever the city wants them or needs them to do. Okay, so this finally turns into a discussion of the city itself and how it would maintain order. Here, Socrates comes up with the famous noble lie. Here's the beginning quote. Then could we come up with some contrivance from among the lies that come along in case of need, the ones we were talking about just now, some one noble lie to persuade at best even the rulers themselves, but if not, the rest of the city, end quote, which he then proceeds to tell in full. It's actually worth quoting this at some length, since this idea of the noble lie is what justifies all the actions that the state might undertake. Um, this is it's not like technically a secular state, but this is essentially a secular state, and here Plato has to introduce this lie to make it seem like it isn't simply a secular state, but is actually following some following following religious principles to appeal to the masses, basically. Um, and yeah, so it's actually worth quoting this in full because this is kind of it's a pretty bold claim, and it has a lot of implications in what Plato believes. Okay, so here's the beginning of the quote. In truth, they themselves were at the time under the soil inside the earth being molded and cultivated, and their weapons and other gear were being crafted, and when they were completely formed, the earth that was their mother made them spring up. So now, as if the land they dwell in were a mother and a nurse, it's up to them to deliberate over it, to defend it if anyone were to attack, and to take thought on behalf of the rest of the citizens as their earth-born siblings. All of you in the city are brothers, but the God, when he molded those of you who are competent to be rulers, mixed gold into them at their formation. But all the auxiliaries have silver in them, and there's iron and bronze in the farmers and other skilled workers. So, since you're all kin, for the most part you'll produce children like yourselves. But it's possible for a silver offspring sometimes to be born from a gold parent, and a gold from a silver. So the god exhorts the rulers first and foremost to be good guardians of their children, of nothing more diligently than that, and to keep watch for nothing so diligently as for what they have intermixed in their souls. And if a child of theirs is born with bronze or iron mixed in it, they'll by no means give way to pity, but paying it the honor appropriate to its nature, they'll drive it out among the craftsmen or farmers, and if in turn any children are born from those parents with gold or silver mixed in them, they'll honor them and take them up, some to the guardian group, the others to the auxiliary, because there's an oracle foretelling that the city will be destroyed when an iron or bronze guardian has guardianship over it. And this is Plato's noble lie. Um, it's a pretty good lie, actually. I bet you could get some people to believe that on the Catholic right. Um, sorry. Excuse me. Um, Coming full circle, then, is there anything more to explain concerning the ways guardians should be brought up? Socrates argues that private property needs to be abolished for the guardians as well as anything that promotes greed. He advocates for military-like lodgings and moderateness in all other respects, that they may best defend the city they have been tasked to defend. All right, so in conclusion then, we started with a review of the last chapter, which showed us the origins of the city. And in this third chapter, we examined the education of guardians. Chapter 3 takes us right up where Chapter 2 left off, with a discussion over censorship and storytelling. Socrates then goes on to examine music and gymnastics as the best way to inculcate a love of beauty and truth. Socrates then goes on to advocate for a type of population control through the judiciary and medicine, where the judiciary gets rid of lower natures/criminals, while medicine lets the weak die off on their own. As an answer to which people should rule, Socrates proposes that it should be the men most dedicated to the service of the country, and he invents a noble lie to ensure that all of the things mentioned are carried out. Yeah, so this is a pretty heavy chapter here. Yeah, and going back to the jokes aside, going back to the Catholic right comment, yeah, I go to the traditional mass, Latin mass. I grew up in it, and obviously, I'm pro-life and all this other stuff. So I don't mean to like put them down, but I've just heard way too many stories of uh, people believing some odd things. So I hope you won't take that joke. I hope those in the Catholic right won't take that joke too amiss. Too amiss. All right. Well, we're actually moving pretty quickly through here. So I think that's about it for politics. I think for politics, I'm going to be trying to do. We've been doing one book approximately per episode, but it looks like that's ending up to be shorter than the full 20 minutes. So I think in the next coming episodes we'll try to get 2 books into the coming episodes and see how that works. All right, well, without further ado, let's turn it over to the economics section of the podcast. Let me take my customary drink. All right. Yeah, I really did not mean to demean like those on the Catholic right. Like, it's just a subset of them. I should have said probably alt-right, but yeah, the Catholic alt-right. There we go. All right, well, turning to economics, yeah, this is the third economic podcast already, so I'll just briefly recapitulate what we went over last time, and then I'll introduce Aristotle's economics as a potentially useful starting point in driving back modern-day economic theory from the realm of ethics. This episode contains a summary of Aristotle's economics, not a critique of it, so don't get upset that I don't respond to certain objectionable things, since I will be critiquing it in the next economic episode. This is exactly what I said in the political section as well. Don't get upset if I pass over something that seems objectionable. It's just so that we don't construct any straw men, and maybe make sure that we're dealing with the authors fairly and trying to help them produce their best argument before engaging with them and before knocking down a straw man. So it's important to realize what these people are saying, so we can then have a sort of then we can have a discussion about it, because we'll know where exactly they stand. All right, so remember that last week we examined some of the problems with modern day economics. The content of philosophy, psychology, and politics to some degree or another has been inappropriately appropriated by economics today. In the first place, positive economics makes value claims based on which course of action ought to be done, which is squarely on ethics turf. Oh, excuse me. And negative economics presupposes the idea that humans are materialistic, consumerist animals. In the second case, economics has also made some absurd claims about models of human behavior, such as, well, yeah, like, people always act in their rational self-interest and, defined as, whatever they feel like, whatever their interest is in, which is simply not true, and has been contradicted by a lot of psychological findings. Again, not that I'm saying that psychology is doing great on its own. It has a replication crisis going on right now, which basically means they've done a bunch of studies and people are trying to redo those studies and they're not able to replicate the results. So as a result, a lot of psychological studies are kind of being called into question. But be that as it may, I mean, it's still, like, without a doubt, false that that humans behave in a totally rational, self-interested manner. Yeah, and again, this is something we can go over in the psychological section of the economic section when we get to psychology. I'll expand on that further. So, yeah, don't get mad that I didn't support that argument there. I'll be supporting it later. Okay, so finally, beyond economics making absurd claims about human behavior, we also now have have our governments measured to the extent that they, raise GDP or are good with the economy. In this way, economics plugs itself into secular theories into public discourse. So, yeah. So again, as I said, economics is treading on ethics' toes here, and it's substituting the ethic of the church, the ethical position that the church had in the before the Reformation, where everyone was Catholic and the state submitted to the church's decrees on ethics and stuff like that, and it's replacing it with a completely secular, desiccated version of that that encourages greed. It encourages um, yeah, consumerism. I mean, and it's just appalling. And it is one of the main reasons why we are where we're at today in terms of like consumerism and all of that. So um, yeah, so that was from the last podcast. So we'll turn now to this podcast. In this podcast, before looking at any specific philosophical, psychological, or political problems with modern day economics, we will start by examining Aristotle's economics to lay the groundwork for what a proper theory of economic behavior might look like. Um, this book, Economics, is attributed to Aristotle. It's not. There is a possibility that it wasn't him that wrote it, but it was probably written by him. And yeah, in economics, he lays out a theory in the book Economics. He lays out a theory concerning the right administration, um, uh, which involves three qualities necessary for good administration and four different types of administrations which ought to follow these rules. So, three rules for any administrations and four administrations. The three rules for good administration are familiarity with the task at hand, good natural endowments, and an upright and industrious way of life. The four different types of administration which ought to follow these rules are the administration of a king, that of governors under him, that of a free state, and that of a private citizen. For the administration of the king, Aristotle states that this is the simplest and most extensive of the four, while the governor's administration is the second most simple and second most extensive, and so on and so on and so on. So Aristotle then argues that the administration of the king, well, okay, this is what I was just saying before. The administration of the king theoretically covers everything, but in practice is restricted to currency, exports, imports, and expenditure. Um, the administration of the governors is concerned with six types of revenue, from agriculture, special products of the country, markets, taxes, cattle, and other sources. Concerning the free state, Aristotle argues that the most important source of revenue in the special products is the special products of the country. Others include revenue from markets and occupations, as well as everyday transactions. Now, I'm going to be honest. I don't know exactly what Aristotle means when he says uh, what the free state exactly refers to. I would imagine it's something like a uh, a city within a larger empire, something like that. That still needs to make its own rules on a more local level. But I can't say that for sure. All right, so finally, we have the administration of the private citizen, where there are three sources of revenue: agriculture, everyday practices, and interest on money. The administration of these four types of administrations, king, governor, free state, citizen, is further based on one common principle. Expenditure must never exceed revenue, i.e., you can't spend more than what you have already. Try telling that to a bank in America today. Um, Aristotle now distinguishes between management of the nation, which he describes as a group of citizens with enough means to live a civilized life, um, and he argues that the management of the house comes before or prior to the management of the nation, since the household can exist without the state, but not the state without the household. So Aristotle now proceeds to lay out two components of a household: the persons in it and material goods. Um, so again, this is what is really interesting about this work. He's not really focused on the politics of an empire or governors or or the free state. He's solely concerned with the administration of the household, um, because if he tried to go into those other realms, that would be politics and not economics. Because economics, I think, in the Greek means like management of the household. Um, so again, this gives us a really important first clue as to what economics might look like. It's the management of a household, not necessarily applying to well, it may or may not apply. I really don't know. I have to go through this with you guys as well because again, I don't know. But it might also include um, higher positions that are higher up, but the fundamental part of uh, economics should center itself around um, the household and how it runs. If Aristotle is correct. Um, so yeah, he argues that the management of the house comes prior to the management of the nation, since the household can exist without the state, but not the state without the household. Aristotle now proceeds to lay out two components of a household: the persons in it and material goods. In terms of the materials in it, Aristotle argues for the necessity of certain occupations, such as farming, to provide materials for the house. In terms of the persons in it, Aristotle distinguishes the wife, who has the first claim to the house in virtue of their relationship, from slaves. With respect to slaves, Aristotle further distinguishes between a chattel slave and one who is in a position of trust. He goes on to consider an argument that slaves should be given work, chastisement, and food, and argues that they should be given a good example by the master and mistress of the household. Sorry. All right. Turning to the relationship between master and mistress, then, Aristotle develops ideas of the relationship between master and mistress towards their property and slaves. So before he considers how a wife and her husband are related to each other in the husband in the management of the household, he's first going to take a look at how each of them compare or what the job of each of them are in relation to the entire household. So the master should have four qualities: the ability to acquire things, the ability to keep what he has acquired, the ability to improve his property, and finally the ability to make use of his property. The mistress of the household should similarly keep an eye on the property and perform regular checkups. Aristotle also argues that she should do more of the sedentary activities like handicrafts, arguing that providence made men stronger and women weaker. In the raising of children, Aristotle argues that both should have equal but different roles in bringing them up: the woman to nurture them and the man to educate them. All right, so that was the relationship of both the husband and the wife to all of their material goods and slaves. Now we turn to the relationship between the husband and his wife itself. All right, we now come to the crux of the crux of the book, which concerns the relationship between husband and wife. Towards the beginning of the book, Aristotle comments on the special union between man and woman and argues that this union is greater than even those seen in the higher animals in nature, since the purpose of the union is not simply to keep on existing, but to keep on happily existing. It's not something blind done by. It's not a blind thing that's done. It's done to further the happiness of the man, the master and the mistress. Um, Thus, both men and women have different qualities, which are nonetheless aimed at the same ends. Um, and then in book three, so that was that he mentioned that in the first book, and now in book three, Aristotle picks up the thread again, arguing that a good wife is one who avoids gossip, manages money, and has an inclination to an honorable and well-ordered life, rather than costliness of raiment or material possessions, as the case may be. He further stresses that the mistress should obey her husband and consider his laws as if they came from God. If she endures these things with patience and gentleness, she will rule easily, otherwise not so easily. She ought to pray that her husband doesn't encounter adversity, but if he should, this becomes an opportunity for her to show her faithfulness to him. And Aristotle here brings up the examples of Penelope and Ulysses as a good example. And I think I know there was one more, but I'm not remembering it. But yeah, so in this story, coincidentally, where the name of the channel comes from, Lashed to the Mast, Odysseus. It takes Odysseus 20 years to get home, and Penelope is running the household for the entirety of those 20 years. And there are suitors, she has a lot of suitors because she's a widow and they want to be king. And she keeps turning them away by pretending to knit, by knitting a tapestry in the daytime, and then the nighttime picking out what she's sewn, so she can do it all over again, and they won't suspect. But basically, she waited 20 years for Odysseus to come back, and was faithful to him for that whole time. And Odysseus was also faithful to her, and so when the time came for their reunification, it was a credit to both of them. Um, yeah. So that had to do with the wife. Flipping the script, Aristotle argues that the wife's training should be the object of her husband's unstinting care. Aristotle argues that the master shouldn't think lightly of his wife and children, but rather should pay the proper attentions to his wife. He also argues that the master has a duty not to be promiscuous, since the master is the mistress's possession. Beginning quote. It is fitting that the man should approach his wife in honorable wise, full of self-restraint and awe, and in his conversation with her should use only the words of a right-minded man, suggesting only such acts as are themselves lawful and honorable, treating her with much self-restraint and trust, and passing over any trivial or unintentional errors she has committed. And furthermore, so that's end quote, and furthermore, beginning quote, between a free woman and her lawful spouse, there should be a reverent and modest mingling of love and fear. For of fear there are two kinds, the fear which virtuous and honorable sons feel towards their fathers, and loyal citizens towards right-minded rulers. It also has for its companions reverence and modesty. But the other kind, felt by slaves for masters and by subjects for despots, who treat them with injustice and wrong, is associated with hostility and hatred. And this just brings to mind some well-known phrases from the Bible, like the fear of the knowledge is the beginning of wisdom, and the fear of knowledge is, and then it goes on to say like a bunch of other things that the fear of knowledge is the cause of. And that's sort of the same thing here. Is like the reason why you have fear is because your body is not really your own in a sense. It is your own, but you have to use it according to the dictates which according to the tendencies that God has set up in you, and that's for on a natural level. That's for the single man to be with a single woman, and for until one or the other dies, and to raise children. Um, and that's basically what Aristotle is saying here. That yeah, and this is why we should come into it with fear, because you don't want to break that relationship, you don't want to strain that relationship, and just the otherness of the person is also something that is strange. And yeah, just the whole thing, it's very awe-inspiring and shouldn't be demeaned or made fun of. So end quote. And then so I ended quote before, but this fear combined with a sense of modesty should be the way that husband and wife should regard each other. And then beginning quote, in all these precepts, it is clear that the poet is teaching husband and wife to dissuade one another from whatever is evil and dishonorable, while unselfishly furthering to the best of their power one another's honorable and righteous aims. In conclusion, then, we have taken up Aristotle's economics as a starting point for developing a working Catholic economic theory. In this episode, we simply presented Aristotle's economics, withholding opinion until the next episode. So we'll be critiquing this work in the next episode. In economics, Aristotle identifies 4 types of administration, along with 3 rules for their implementation. These 4 types of administrations are the king, the governors, the free state, and the private citizen. The 3 rules for the proper administration of the king, the governors, the free state, and the private citizen are familiarity with the task at hand, good natural endowments, and an upright and industrious way of life. Furthermore, Aristotle argues that the bedrock principle for all 4 of these administrations is that expenditure should never exceed revenue. So don't end up with a loss on your balance sheet. Turning now to the administration of the private citizen, Aristotle posits 2 things that a household is made up of: the persons in it, and the material goods and slaves, which he argues should be treated, fairly humanely, although he does say it's chastisement. We'll get into that in the next episode. Maybe jumping the gun a little bit there. He argues that Aristotle argues that the man of the household should have four essential qualities: the ability to acquire things, the ability to keep what he has acquired, the ability to improve his property, and finally, the ability to make use of his property. Finally, Aristotle goes in depth into the relationship between master and mistress and argues for a certain fear and modesty of both of them, and that argues that the mistress should nurture the children while the master educates them, and Aristotle considers this union between the man and the wife to be the strongest there is. Um, all right, well, I think that pretty much does it for economics. It's going to be a bit of a shorter video today, it looks like. Well, for the full length podcast anyway. So yeah, just remember my announcement. Oh yeah, I also have another announcement to make as well. I'm going to be moving the gaming podcast to Thursdays, not Mondays, just because we've been dealing with a ton of technical issues, and also it gives time to prepare, better prepare for each. So yeah, that's not going to come out tonight, but don't worry, that will come out on Thursday. All right, and then also remember uh, my other announcement, which was that I'm going to be trying to read up as much on the Ukraine-Russian war that I can, and hopefully present something informational to you guys uh, within the next like month or month and a half. All right, I think that's about everything. Thank you again for watching, especially if you made it this far. You were truly a hero if you made it this far. I barely made it this far. So thank you all, and God bless you. See you next time.